The moment the grid goes down, water becomes more dangerous than thirst. Not immediately, not in the first hour while pressure still lingers in the pipes, but in the silent transition that follows when the system you trusted begins to decay from the inside. Most people imagine a blackout as darkness, as silence, as the loss of light and communication. But the real collapse begins underground, inside miles of pressurized infrastructure designed for continuity, not failure. When electricity stops, pumps stall, pressure zones destabilize, and the thin barrier that separates clean drinking water from contamination begins to erode. What remains in your faucet is not a resource, but a countdown. Modern water systems are engineered around continuous flow and controlled pressure gradients. Every city relies on electrically powered pumps to move water from treatment plants through distribution networks, maintaining a delicate balance that prevents backflow and contamination. The danger is not just that water stops flowing, but that the absence of pressure allows external contaminants, soil bacteria, sewage intrusion, chemical runoff, to enter the system through microscopic breaches and aging pipe joints. This is not hypothetical, it is a well-documented failure mode in emergency management scenarios. Once pressure drops below critical thresholds, the system can no longer guarantee potability, even if water still flows. The illusion of safety persists long after the system has already failed. The common misunderstanding is that stored water is the only solution, that survival depends purely on how much you have stockpiled before the event. While storage is critical, it is finite by definition, and most households underestimate both consumption needs and contamination risks. A typical person requires a minimum of 3 to 4 liters per day under controlled conditions, but in a grid-down scenario with heat stress, hygiene challenges, and limited sanitation, that requirement increases significantly. More importantly, stored water does not address the long-term problem, the inability to replenish safely. Without a system, survival becomes a race against depletion. The hidden science lies in understanding water as a cycle, not a static resource. Even in a grid-down environment, water continues to exist in multiple accessible forms: atmospheric humidity, groundwater, surface runoff, and even residual pressure within infrastructure. The key is not finding water, but converting uncertain sources into reliable supply through controlled processes. This requires leveraging fundamental principles of fluid dynamics, filtration, and microbiological control. For example, gravity-fed systems, which rely on elevation differences rather than electrical pumps, can sustain flow indefinitely if designed correctly. Similarly, slow sand filtration, a method used for centuries, can remove pathogens through biological activity within a carefully maintained filter bed without requiring electricity or complex machinery. Evidence from disaster zones consistently shows that communities with decentralized water solutions recover faster and experience fewer health crises. After major earthquakes and hurricanes, centralized systems often fail for days or weeks, but individuals who can access alternative sources, rainwater harvesting, gravity-fed storage, improvised filtration, maintain a critical advantage. In contrast, those who rely solely on municipal supply face a rapid decline in sanitation, leading to outbreaks of waterborne diseases such as cholera and dysentery. The transition from inconvenience to medical emergency can occur in less than 72 hours, especially in densely populated areas where contamination spreads quickly. The survival implication is clear. Water security is not about subhas, it is about continuity. A hidden system is not a luxury, it is a requirement if you intend to outlast the initial phase of collapse. This system must operate independently of electricity, resist contamination, and adapt to changing conditions. It must transform unpredictable inputs into predictable outputs. Without it, every decision you make becomes constrained by scarcity, and scarcity drives risk. People take chances with questionable water sources, skip purification steps, and expose themselves to pathogens that can incapacitate them when medical care is no longer available. As the situation escalates, the environment itself begins to change. Stagnant water becomes a breeding ground for bacteria and insects. Waste accumulates without proper sanitation, increasing the likelihood of cross-contamination. Each of these factors compounds the risk, creating a feedback loop that accelerates deterioration. The longer the grid remains down, the more hostile the environment becomes, not because of external threats, but because of the invisible degradation of essential systems. To move beyond this vulnerability, you have to think in layers, not single solutions. A resilient approach integrates collection, storage, filtration, and distribution into a cohesive system that can function under stress. It anticipates failure points and compensates for them. It does not rely on a single method, but combines multiple techniques to ensure redundancy. This is where most people fail, not in effort, but in design. They prepare for one scenario, one source, one method, and when that fails, they have nothing to fall back on. The transition from dependence to resilience begins with a shift in perspective. Water is not something you store, it is something you manage. The system you build must be capable of evolving as conditions change, maintaining quality even as inputs vary. This requires an understanding of not just how to collect water, but how to protect it from contamination at every stage. It requires discipline, consistency, and a willingness to operate outside the assumptions of normal life. Because once the grid goes down, normal no longer exists, and the difference between survival and collapse is not what you have, but what you can sustain. As the hours stretch into the first full day without power, a second, less visible failure begins to unfold, one that most people never anticipate because it does not announce itself with noise or darkness. The water that still trickles from taps carries an assumption of safety, a residual trust in a system that no longer has the ability to verify its own integrity. This is where the real danger intensifies, because contamination is not always visible, not always detectable by taste or smell, and often delayed in its effects. By the time symptoms appear, gastrointestinal distress, dehydration, fever, the damage is already underway, and in a grid-down environment, treatment options are severely limited. The threat is not immediate collapse, but progressive degradation, a slow erosion of health that weakens decision-making and physical capability at the exact moment resilience is most critical. To understand why this happens, you have to look at how water systems are designed under normal conditions. Municipal infrastructure depends on continuous monitoring, chemical dosing, and controlled flow rates. Chlorination, for example, is not a one-time process. It is a dynamic balance that ensures residual disinfectant levels remain effective throughout the distribution network. When power fails, dosing systems stop and the residual chlorine begins to dissipate. At the same time, reduced flow allows biofilms, thin layers of microbial growth that exist naturally inside pipes, to expand and release bacteria into the water stream. This is not a rare anomaly. It is an expected outcome when a controlled system loses its control mechanisms. The longer the stagnation persists, the more pronounced the microbial activity becomes. A common misunderstanding is that boiling alone is a universal solution, a simple fix that converts any questionable water into something safe. While heat is effective at killing most pathogens, it does nothing to remove chemical contaminants, heavy metals, or particulate matter. In a compromised distribution system, especially in urban environments, water can carry residues from industrial runoff, corroded pipes, and backflow from sewage systems. Boiling concentrates these contaminants by reducing volume, potentially increasing toxicity. The belief that heat equals safety is only partially correct, and in some cases, dangerously misleading. The hidden science that often goes unnoticed is the concept of multi-barrier treatment, a principle used in advanced water purification systems. Instead of relying on a single method, effective treatment combines physical filtration, chemical disinfection, and sometimes adsorption processes to address different categories of contaminants. Physical filtration removes suspended solids and many microorganisms. Chemical disinfection targets pathogens that pass through filters. Adsorption, often using activated carbon, captures organic compounds and certain chemicals. Each layer compensates for the limitations of the others, creating a system that is far more robust than any single approach. This layered strategy is not complex in theory, but it requires intentional design and an understanding of how each component interacts. Evidence from field operations in disaster zones reinforces reinforces this approach. Emergency response teams rarely depend on boiling alone. They deploy portable systems that integrate filtration and chemical treatment, often with redundancy built in. Studies conducted after major flooding events show that households using combined methods, such as filtration followed by chlorination, experience significantly lower rates of waterborne illness compared to those relying on a single method. The data is consistent across different environments, from urban centers to rural communities, highlighting a universal principle. Complexity in treatment leads to simplicity in outcomes because it reduces uncertainty. The survival implications become more severe as the situation extends beyond the initial phase. As stored water supplies diminish, individuals are forced to seek alternative sources: rainwater, surface water, even reclaimed wastewater. Each source introduces its own set of risks, from microbial contamination to chemical exposure. Without a system capable of adapting to these variations, the margin for error narrows rapidly. A single mistake, a single lapse in treatment can lead to illness that compromises not just the individual, but anyone relying on them. In a scenario where cooperation and shared resources are essential, one point of failure can cascade into a broader crisis. Escalation occurs when environmental and behavioral factors intersect. Reduced water availability leads to compromised hygiene, which increases the spread of pathogens. Limited sanitation infrastructure allows waste to contaminate local water sources, creating a feedback loop that amplifies risk. At the same time, psychological stress and fatigue reduce adherence to safety protocols. People skip steps, cut corners, and make decisions based on urgency rather than accuracy. The system does not fail all at once. It unravels through a series of small compromises that accumulate over time. To counter this, the concept of a hidden water system becomes not just practical, but essential. This system is not defined by a single device or technique, but by its ability to operate independently, maintain quality, and adapt to changing inputs. It must account for variability in source water, fluctuations in availability, and the inevitability of contamination. It must be simple enough to maintain under stress, yet robust enough to handle worst-case scenarios. This balance is difficult to achieve, but it is the difference between temporary survival and sustained resilience. The transition to such a system requires a shift from reactive to proactive thinking. Instead of waiting for contamination to occur and then attempting to fix it, the system is designed to prevent contamination at every stage. Collection methods minimize exposure to pollutants. Storage solutions protect against environmental intrusion. Treatment processes address multiple threat vectors simultaneously. Distribution within the system ensures that once water is treated, it remains protected until consumption. Each stage is interconnected, forming a continuous loop that maintains integrity even as external conditions deteriorate. Because as the grid remains down and the initial shock gives way to prolonged instability, the question is no longer whether you have water, but whether your system can keep producing it safely, day after day, without relying on anything that no longer exists.